back.
We're back.
I'm Lee.
And I'm Rob.
And we're the China Literature Podcast.
We're it. We're the only one.
We are it.
That could be good or bad.
Yeah.
So we're changing locations. For the last several, we've been in the graduate lounge of the Comparative Literature Department here at the University of Oregon. Now, we're in an abandoned office in the basement of Friendly Hall.
It sounds very haunted. We're approaching Halloween.
Yep.
When we're recording this, though, when you listen to this, it might be much later.
much later, years later.
When the prosecutors are trying to get all the evidence to reconstruct who these crazy men were.
They're like, well, let's go to this abandoned room. There's nothing in there.
What are we discussing today?
So today we're discussing Akyu Zhongzhuan by Lu Xun.
Okay.
And we're discussing it because it's one of those works, at least in mainland China, which is sort of the Big Bang. This is like this and Kwang Energy, Diary of a Madman,
both
by Lu Xun.
Yep.
These are sort of like the alpha and the omega. This is the alpha of modern Chinese literature for a certain kind of reader, like modern Chinese readers in the mainland in their high school classes and university curricula. This is what they're taught. Like 1919, when these things are published, is the beginning of modern China.
Yeah. Before we get into kind of the reception, I think we should save that for later.
Yeah.
But could you tell us a little bit more about this fits into?
Well,
you said 1919. This moment, the moment that these things are written, is the beginning of modern Chinese literature.
Right.
Can you explain kind of like what goes before and how this affects what goes after?
So Lu Xun is a couple of our podcasts have been on the late Qing dynasty, which ends in...
If they exist.
If they exist. It's the podcast, not the late Qing. Right. The Qing dynasty, the final dynasty in China, ends 1911.
Huh.
And for the last decade or so of the Qing, and on into this, what we call the Republican period, writers and scholars are really grappling with the influx of Western cultures and knowledge, and are looking at their own culture and going, why are we so behind everyone else in terms of technology?
Lo ho would be the term in Chinese, like backwards.
Backward. Why are we so backwards?
Yeah.
Of course, there's lots of ways to read that from our perspective now, but from their perspective, they're getting pushed around by every country on the planet, including the Japanese, who are supposed to be quote-unquote Asians like them, yellow people, they call themselves.
Although that's a very modern idea.
That's a very modern idea, yeah.
Though they did, I guess we should point out, they did have a long relationship with the Japanese, and they thought of the Japanese as below.
Yeah. And so a number of scholars began experimenting a little bit with a lot more colloquial Chinese writing. Colloquial Chinese had always existed, just like local language had always existed in European and American cultures, but nobody wrote with it.
Right. So I think that's actually a really good analogy that you bring up. What we're having right there is, I try and explain it this way to my students. Imagine if Latin had been the language of Europe up until 1911.
Yep.
Or 1919, really. Like, Latin is this old class. It's not only a classical, but it's classicized language that everyone in this vast community can speak.
Small community.
It's a small community, elite community, because no one who's farming reads Latin. So that's the same thing that's kind of going on with Chinese. You have this form of there's not really a vocabulary to talk, or it's difficult to talk about in English. So we'll use Chinese. You have Wenyan, which is classical Chinese, and that's read by all of the elite. It's the lingua franca, written lingua franca for all of the elite. And then you have people who don't read or speak that, who are speaking their local tongues. And, like everyone who can read Wenyan is also able to speak their local tongue and maybe some sort of shared lingua franca. But that lingua franca is not necessarily Wenyan. But everyone is writing in Wenyan for the most part. There were some things before that weren't written in Wenyan.
And it has begun to change by the end of the Qing. Like you have sometimes wen yan wen, but with different diction and more words.
Even like the Shito Ji, the Hong Among, the Dream of the Red Mansion, before that, those are written in something like kind of in between stuff.
Right. So, but the one thing that really hasn't been done is to write something in a recognizably colloquial style. Like, it's a little bit, honestly, like Luther's translation of the Bible into German. There had been copies of the German, or the Bible translated to German before that, but nobody had translated the Bible, A, completely into German, and B, into completely ordinary, everyday German. Luther threw in little German idioms. He excised certain phrases that he felt like the ordinary German person would have no ability to understand. And late Qing scholars are not yet at the point where they're writing or even translating in the kind of Chinese that if you were an ordinary person and you heard this story, you probably couldn't read it, but if you heard it, you'd be right there. So, 1919 and Lu Xun's publication of Kuang Energy and then Akyu Zhengzhuan, which is translated the true story of Akyu. And the reason these are so big is less because they're just magnificent pieces of art, although I do really, really enjoy them, but they're written in a style that, a lot like Luther's German translation of the Bible, would have been recognized by anyone hearing them as the people on the street talking. Or maybe not that colloquial, but very, very much more colloquial than anything that had been written before it. And done in a literary way. This isn't, neither of these pieces are, I mean, they have an obvious literary quality to them. It's clear that the person writing them is not just translating a newspaper article or something. There's a sense of artifice about them. And so let's get into actual Akyu Zhengzhuan, the true story of Akyu, and talk about, we're going to talk about, get a little summary of it, and then we're going to really focus on a couple of things, one of which is
the ending, right?
The ending, which is
amazing.
Which is truly amazing. It really is amazing. And partly the beginning, the introduction as well, because it's amazing in a very different way.
Why don't we start out with the ending?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
You want to start with the ending? Let's give a quick overview, though, of the story. So, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. The structure of the story itself is fairly simple. It's written, the Chinese term zhengzhuan it's actually an older form of writing. It's sort of like a biography.
Official biography.
That's a better word. Official biography. Now, what's funny about this, I really do think it's funny, is that it's an official biography about nobody. The guy it's written about is nobody to the extent that he doesn't even have a name. Yeah. Like Q, when we say Q Zhengzhuan, the Q is the English letter Q. And the writer begins the story by essentially saying, I don't even know who this guy is. Which begs the question, why is he writing an official biography about him? And we'll talk here. But, so, Akyu is a random dude doing...
in a random village called No Village.
Literally in Chinese, Weizhuang literally means no-name village. Nothingville, you know.
Nothingville, I think that's...
Yeah, it's an Elvis Presley song, too, which... if we want to later, we can sing.
I think Lu Xun was alluding to Elvis Presley in the future.
I would go with that. He predicted the rise of Elvis. Or maybe Elvis wrote a song about this.
Yeah, that might make more sense.
It's his tribute to Lu Xun.
I don't know that Lu Xun is a known time traveler. We haven't established that. So.
But it would be worth doing a future podcast on the possibility of that. So, guy comes from Nothingville, and the majority of the story is just him being an idiot. I mean, literally, it's these vaudevillian routines where he'll, see a beggar in the street and decide he wants to, assert his superiority over the beggar and gets in a fight and loses. And then he's in a rich person's house. He's sort of like a migrant worker. He just kind of picks up odd jobs where he can.
Yeah.
And he's listening to the kitchen maid talk about something and then decides that he wants her sexually and tries to rush her, and she runs out, and then everybody comes in and beats him up. I mean, it's just over and over and over. Yeah. The whole story is just one episode after another of him looking stupid.
And I'll have to say, I really, for the most part, don't have any sympathy for him.
You have no sympathy.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, he's written in such a way that he's not oppressed. It's not like he leaves each encounter weeping and thinking to himself, why does this happen to me?
He's a moron.
He's a moron. He leaves every encounter thinking of a new way to explain away the shame that he's just incurred. Like, well, actually, it's this, so I'm fine.
There's a like a famous kind of trope in this where he's got to like explain how his defeat was a victory. He beats himself up just so that he can say he won a fight.
Yeah, exactly. So this whole story over and over is just him being an idiot, getting in trouble, getting beaten up. We could recount a bunch of them, but then 2/3 of the way through the story, and there's a village who has cut off his Q, Q-U-E-U, something like that?
Q-U-E-U-E.
Yeah, there you go, thank you. Which was totally shameful. You didn't cut off that Q, that sort of ponytail thing. It was...
it was illegal.
It was basically... Yeah, you're right, it was illegal, yeah. Anyway, so there are rumors that the next city over, which we also don't have a name for, it's just, I think, Chengshi in the story, that there's a revolution coming. And Akyu hears about this and says to himself, you know what, I want in on this, because I know what revolution is. Revolution's where you get to get revenge on all the people you don't like. Yeah. So I'm in, let's do this. And he even lies awake at night thinking about whose homes he's going to plunder and whose wives he's going to take and that kind of thing. Then the revolution comes and goes without him to the village. The guy without the Q, without the Bianzi in Chinese, is sort of the ringleader, or one of them anyway, and excludes Akyu completely, possibly because Akyu didn't say he wanted to be involved. He just expected to be involved.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's almost not excluding him.
Exactly. So, anyway, Akyu inquires into, hey, what the heck? Why don't I get to be a part of the revolution? And
because
then...
running his mouth.
He's running his mouth, and what happens when he starts running his mouth?
Other people hear this, and then he is essentially arrested. Mm-hmm. There's again another vaudevillian scene where they are invading the place where he lives, which is like a temple, like a, I think, grain god temple.
Yeah.
But they're kind of like commando style almost.
Yeah.
And but it's just this one moron who's in there like asleep. And he gets arrested and taken to the city. He's sort of put on trial. I don't think it talked about...
Kind of formal trial. That's right, like he has a judge and a jury and all that.
Right,
He's questioned by the magistrate
extensively. Yeah. They try and find out where the other people involved in the revolution are, which he knows nothing, and he says he knows nothing. They keep asking him, like, do you have any more to say? And he says, mayo. Like, no, nothing. I don't have anything. Again and again. That occurs several times. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that is that it's only when he shuts up, he doesn't have anything to say, that we find him sympathetic.
Yeah, this is what we wanted to get to. This is kind of the crux of this story for us, is the moment where the story becomes more than just a series of stupid little vignettes, is this moment when this nobody from a nobody town in the middle of nowhere encounters this political action, this revolution. We're not told which revolution, incidentally. We assume it's the revolution in 1911.
I think it's actually one, like a kind of proto-revolution before that.
Yeah. Anyway, but just like Wei Zhuang, just like the Nothingville and the Nothing Person, this is a nothing revolution. This could be any revolution.
Sure.
So, yeah. And so this guy clearly understands nothing about what even politics even is. He has no clue. Mm-hmm. And he's thrust into the middle of it. And in the middle of it is where, for the first time, like Lee was saying, he shuts up and expresses fear. Now he has no defenses left. He can't say to himself, oh, well, this is clearly this. Because this is not normal physical violence. He's being questioned by strange people about strange things. And when he says, mayo, like, I don't have anything to say, in the story, he doesn't say it defiantly. He doesn't say it even fearfully most of the time. He just says it in a perplexed way, like, what would I have to say? What are you talking about? Mm. He literally doesn't even understand what exactly they're wanting from him. Like, where is everyone else? And he's like, well, what are you talking about? And what makes him, at least for me, and tell me if you agree with this, what makes him sympathetic in this part of the story is precisely that he has no idea what's going on.
I mean, I think that's one of the things, but for me, just kind of the violence, the sort of oppressive state violence that he's facing is is what makes me sympathetic of him.
Yeah, that too. And so this continues 3 times. He says mayo. You can read some biblical themes into that if you want. But and then he's taken out. There were multiple people in the back of the whatever they're riding in wagon, and he's executed. He's shot at the end of the story.
And it's an interesting moment when that happens, because he doesn't, up to that point when he's being questioned, he doesn't know he's facing execution. No one tells him.
Right.
He's not, again, too dumb to realize what's actually
too dumb, or to jump in here, he's simply, it's not even that he's too dumb, he's of a part of the country where people have no clue what's going on.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that ending is incredible, because you really see him afraid for the first time, and he is resigned to his death to a certain. I mean, he talks about he talks with a sort of resignation. You know, like some days you have to face execution, and some days you don't. I think is the quote. I don't have it in front of me, but it's really incredibly sad. I don't know what the right word is.
It's sad, but it's sad in a way that, frankly, I think is unique. I don't recall a lot of other stories in any other culture where this is the way a character dies. Like when you read, I just got finished reading Germinal by Émile Zola about French coal miners, and people in that story sometimes die horrifically. But there's always a sense of melancholy, and there's always a sense of consciousness, like it's the mind that's devouring us. It's the bourgeois labor and leaving us to starve, things like that. Here, you have a guy who we don't even know. He takes odd jobs, but he's not really a laborer. He's a flunky.
Again, he is nobody.
He's nobody, and even a total moron would know at this point that he's on his way out to be shot. But as the story goes on, we don't read moments of panic or anger or combativeness. It's like you were just saying, it's literally like he's resigned to what's happening. And that resignation is something that definitely plagued Lu Xun. The story goes when before Lu Xun started writing this stuff that he was educated. Well, not story. He was really educated in Japan as a doctor, and he saw a film reel, a news reel, of a political action elsewhere in China. I forget where. I should go look it up.
It was in Manchuria. He sees all of these Chinese people standing around, and I believe it was a Japanese military official who cut the head off of a Chinese man who was there. And the question that he asked himself is, why are all these Chinese people just like watching this?
Yeah, not just watching, but watching with this air of like, well, whatever. Like no one appears horrified or sad, they're just watching.
It's not me, therefore it's not my problem.
And it's this resignation that you see in Lu Xun, especially in AQ.
Let's talk about that resignation a little. Because the story ends with him being shot, but that's not the final word, is it?
No.
The final word
good point.
is, I believe, it's the crowd.
It's the crowd, but it's the villagers in Weizhuang as well.
Right. The villagers in Weizhuang, the crowd is looking at him and wishing there had been more blood in his death. It's like this kind of like, I almost want to say ribald.
Or burlesque sort of like.
Yeah.
Man, if only there had been more blood. That sucks, you know.
And so we have this moment of profound sympathy that we are identifying with AQ, but then we go and we see, we like get to float into the consciousness of the crowd, and they're not doing it. And that's one of the things that's so amazing about that ending.
And there's a lot of things that are amazing about the story. There's that, and there's the fact that, and this is something I really appreciate about reading Lu Xun, is that you read a lot of politically conscious, however you want to define that, writers, and it almost always ends up being fairly superficial or flat. That the characters are just types. This person is not a character you would want to anchor a political diatribe, because you're choosing someone, first of all, that no one can like. And then he's thrust into a situation where the only thing that saves him is his...
As a character.
Is his not refusal to speak, his inability to speak, and his perplexity at what's going on in the world.
I think one of the things that makes this story so great, and that makes Akio a good character, is that he's not a good character. He is a type up until the point where he's executed.
It's a good point.
And then we have this really strange shift where our sympathies go out to him.
Yeah.
He's just, like a fourth stooge for most of the story, like trying to rape women because he thinks he needs to have children, I guess. Like, that was a very weird scene, but it's something we can't, as readers, we're not allowed to empathize with him. And then suddenly we're forced to empathize with him.
Yeah. But again, empathize with him in a way that doesn't ennoble him. He's not a hero at the end.
He's nobody still.
He's still nobody. He doesn't rise above anything. He's completely crushed. But
we empathize with that nobody. And that's what makes it so amazing. And that's, I think, the ending. We see the at all empathizing with him. Then we kind of are like jerked back into that world where we were at. And we have to, it forces us to re-examine the perspective that we held earlier in the story.
Yeah.
All right.
So let's wind this up actually by talking about the way the story is received.
Something that we hit on at the beginning.
Something we hit on the beginning, in which I should clarify, I spent almost 10 years in mainland China. Lee's coming at it from a different place, right?
Slightly different, yeah. I spent 2 years in mainland China and then a year in Taiwan.
Now the story in mainland China, Lu Xun, not just the story, but Lu Xun in particular, is sort of the revolutionary par excellence. Like, he's the guy. He's one of the few writers that is never purged, never struggled against, as they put it in communist rhetoric.
We should point out he died in the 30s.
Yeah.
He didn't live to the point where the revolution couldn't eat him.
Right. So,
but he's loved.
Okay, so let me give you a practical example here. Yeah. So, when I was teaching English there, I did an activity once just to get them talking.
And this is in northern China?
This was in Tianjin. Yeah, just about 2 hours south of Beijing. At one of the universities that had students, and we were talking. And I gave them an activity. And I gave them, I think, 15 possible people, Chinese people. And I said, I want you to put them in order from greatest to least great. And it was everybody from Qin Huangdi to Jackie Chan. Like, everybody's in there, including Lu Xun. And every single group in the class put Lu Xun as number 1 or 2.
Really? Even higher than Qin?
Even much higher than him. Most of them put him ahead of Mao Zedong, ahead of a lot of people. Yeah.
Wow.
And this speaks to this sort of almost mythology that has sprung up around Lu Xun as the great, not defender of the people, but sort of the voice of the voiceless. Like, he puts into print what the common people had always struggled with.
You use the word common people, and I think that term is interesting.
Yeah.
Because you've also talked about how, though he is kind of this sacred figure in mainland China, and particularly in kind of communist circles, there's also only one way he's allowed to. There are a lot of restrictions. Could you talk more about that?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Because he's this figure, like the reading we just gave of AQ would not be accepted really in mainland. When I say not accepted in mainland China, I don't mean like we get in trouble. But he's read this story, for example, and I'll tell you how this applies in a second. But this is read as AQ is someone. He's an ordinary Chinese person who's been totally corrupted and made ignorant by traditional learning.
Specifically, the word they would use is feudalism. Right?
Feudalism, yeah. We had a visiting scholar once I got a master's degree at Nankai University in Tianjin. We had a visiting scholar, and he was giving a reading of Lu Xun's Zawen, which is sort of like an early form of blogs.
Yeah. Just
little thoughts that he wrote down. I gave a lecture about it, and then afterwards, one of my friends, who I would consider fairly progressive, I mean,
This is another student.
Right. Yeah. Very progressive. He loves reading everything from Immanuel Kant to stuff that people don't typically read. And he said, "So what did you think of the lecture?" And I said, "Well, I thought it was okay. I mean, wasn't mind-blowing or anything, but it had some interesting stuff. And then he said, it wasn't good. He said, you can't read Lu Xun this way. You can't read his Zhawen that way.
Do you think that Zhang Lao's reading of Lu Xun was off at all?
No, it wasn't off. It was very different. He was trying to sort of do a different reading of these sort of blog form pieces. And I don't recall exactly what he said anymore, but it was very stylistically oriented, formally oriented, we might say.
I think like whatever Zhang Lao's argument was, it's not really the point that you're getting at. The point that you're getting at is that Lu Xun is kind of restricted in the way he's read because he is this semi-religious, semi-mythical.
He's a political revolutionary. He's the voice of the voiceless, etc., etc. And this is why, for the most part, you only read a handful of what he wrote. For example, no one really talks about Wild Grass yet, which hopefully we'll talk about in different podcasts, partly because it's
when
just
we wrap our heads around it.
It's beautiful. That's one of my favorite pieces of writing in the 20th century, so hopefully we get to talk about it. But that doesn't fit with the whole voice of the voiceless thing, because it's just too weird, you know? And so for a Chinese Q can be difficult, Chinese audience anyway.
You mentioned that he can be difficult. Why do you,
Well, for example, and we've talked a lot about this before the podcast, but this story is very hard to not make sense of, but it doesn't fit into any of these neat little categories.
So it's difficult because the mainland Chinese readers feel that they have to fit it into these categories, and Lu Xun denies them that opportunity to a certain extent.
If you really read it, you just can't do that. Beginning with his calling this a Zhengzhuan, an official biography, so he's already calling up this classical tradition. I'm writing a classical story. Oh wait, but I'm writing it about somebody that you can't write it about. Okay, so that sounds like a satire, but the main character is so pathetic, and in a way that is, unlike what a lot of mainland Chinese readers would say, we don't have any real notion of why he's this way. It's not like he comes from a broken home where, foreign soldiers killed his parents or something.
There's no real sense that feudalism has made him bad.
Lu Xun doesn't give us that. He's just a guy in a nothing village, and this is the way he ends up, and that's it. And so it's confusing because he's not the kind of character you'd want in, even Nikolai Gogol, who Lu Xun read extensively, had I think at times, very clearly delineated landowners, this kind of person. It was quote-unquote realistic. AQ is, what do you do with this person? So he problematizes this idea that this is a politically realistic story or a satire or a biography. It doesn't really fit into those.
But so he's read in this very restricted way, but he's still read quite a bit, right?
Yes, he's in every high school and college class. Everyone has read this story.
One of the things I think that's interesting is in Taiwan, he's not read at all. I think a mainland Chinese reader would say, well, that's because he was censored. He certainly was censored. You could get sent to Green Island prison if you were caught reading him at some points in the 60s and 70s. And even into the 90s, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think he was censored until the 90s. You weren't allowed to read him. Libraries, schools weren't allowed to teach classes on him. And so, yes, he was very censored. But what I don't understand is, for me, I have less, there's less of a joy for me to read some of Lu Xun's work than maybe you or mainland Chinese readers, I guess. But I feel like if he is really as great of a writer as people make him out to be, he would be more read on Taiwan once it would kind of open the floodgates. But he's not. I just got a copy in Taiwan of Lu Xun, and it's first off quite hard to find. It's not, you can't buy the complete works in a store, which the Taiwanese are huge readers. I bought the book at 3 a.m. in a 24-hour bookstore in Taipei. I
remember those, yeah.
But, he's he's not really that big. And the book actually starts out with like, well, it's very disappointing that in Taiwan we don't read Lu Xun that much. Mm-hmm. So the book itself, the editor is making an argument that they should read more Lu Xun in Taiwan, but I don't think he's very successful. And I think part of that is aesthetic reasons. Until we get to the end of IQ, I enjoyed the story a lot less. We're both in a class with Professor Roy Chan, and every time I hear Chan talk Lu Xun's writing, or IQ particularly, I like it, but then I go back to reading it, and it's just it's not a joy for me to read until the end there, and then it kind of grabs you and says, you are a human, we are all humans, that kind of thing. But you have to kind of like wade through the less enjoyable parts.
And I enjoyed even the weird slapstick parts because it is frankly just funny. I mean, there's a scene
funny
where
to try and imagine it. Like,
well, there's a scene where he's fighting with this guy whose name is just Xiao D, big letter D, and they've gotten a hold of each other's cues and they're yanking them. Total Three Stooges parody.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing. Everybody's standing around wondering, well, when do we break this up? Now, that's not a great piece of art, possibly, but I find it hilarious. And you're right in the sense that reading Lu Xun from an aesthetic point of view can be frustrating at times because...
Except maybe in cases like Wild Grass, which is much better aesthetic.
And I was about to say, my argument about Lu Xun is that he's one of these writers who... Okay, my best analog, this is going to be really weird, one of my modern analog
Go for it.
is a Japanese band called Boris. They're technically a heavy metal band. I don't really know if you'd call them that. Anyway, if any of you out there listen to Boris, you'll know what I'm talking about. But they're one of those groups that...
The listener is familiar with
Boris. Of course. But, you know, I don't know how many albums they've got. They've probably got 3 that are really good. And those are so freaking good that I mean, I've been listening to them forever now. Like, they don't get old. They're just amazing. Now, when they're bad, they're real bad. I mean, they're just unlistenable. And I feel like that's Lu Xun. Like, when Lu Xun hits, like with Wild Grass or AQ or possibly Diary of a Madman, I think it's genuinely stunning. When he misses, and he misses frequently, I think, because he wrote a ton, you know, it's bad. It's real bad. But I think possibly that's why he's not read in some places, but I would definitely like to see him read, some of his works at least read more, in point of view even.
Well, I think that's it. Do you have any...
That's my parting salvo.
I actually think that's a great parting salvo, so I think we're going to call it. I'm Lee.
And I'm Rob.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.